So the New Testament has a lot of letters, or some people call it epistles. Letters is probably more appropriate. So let's talk a little bit about letter writing in the New Testament world. Pulling up our PowerPoint for that. Let's take a look at what we can learn about that. So ancient letter writing at the time pretty much consisted of kind of like a set layout there. You see an example here of a letter. You see the large Greek, what we call uncials, kind of capitalized letters here. But typically they had a greeting to the addressee or the addressees, then a main body that may have different kinds of formats, and then there typically is a farewell associated with. Now, something to really get a grasp of is this idea that the New Testament letters were what we call occasional documents. That means that they were written for a specific reason. They were written to specific people or communities for a specific reason, to address specific matters in a specific location at a specific time. Okay, everything's specific. So in other words, no one is perceived as sitting down and thinking, I think we should write a Bible letter and kind of write something about this is what God is like, or this is how people should do marriage, or this is how people should do church, or this is how people should relate to one another where it comes to matters of interacting in society or something. No, they were always responsive. So occasional documents means they are responding to situations in places. So remember this busy, busy beehive and everything socially going on. And then this is kind of like this idea of people writing in response to situations and issues rising up in these communities. So that means that what is being responded to in, say, Ephesus may not be the same way that one might respond to a similar issue in, say, Rome or in Antioch, Syria. And that's very important to keep in mind, because if we just, in this day and age, just think, we have an issue where we live, or I wonder what would happen if we had an issue like that where we live. We must always take notice that it was written to a particular location and a particular situation, a particular time that may not have been the same had that situation occurred in Northern Africa in the first century. So it has to come through filters, right? So we have 21 letters in the New Testament, and we have a total of 27 canonized books. So if you take off the 4 gospel writings, and you take off the book of Acts, and you take off the letter or the book rather to the people in Asia Minor, so the Revelation of John, then what's left are 21 New Testament letters, and they're rather diverse. Notice that some of them have multiple letters, like 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So they go to somewhat similar places or people. And of course, then the question becomes, how do we read and understand them? So if they can be diverse and they have a certain kind of format, then how are you supposed to understand them? And then ultimately, how do you apply them in today's time and with today's challenges? And sometimes when I teach this material in the classroom, I do an interesting, what I think is interesting, activity in the classroom. I have my students listen to an old song by rock band U2. It's called In a Little While, and they listen to it, and I give them the lyrics, and it says in a little while. And they listen to all of that, and I explain to them that that song was played when a rock artist, a punk rock artist, was actually on his deathbed. It's actually a rather sad story. And as this person was breathing his last, he had requested to listen to that song over and over again. And this is a while ago, and so the song was on repeat. And he drew a lot of strength from listening to that song. And so I asked them to kind of circle the things in the song that makes sense, that the person would request that song. And so typically my students, they find some things in the song that makes sense, but some things are also a little bit puzzling. And so they circle some things, and then I ask them to they do this in groups to relate to each other why they think it's a Joey Ramone from the Ramones, the punk rock band. Why they think Joey Ramone, who was passing away, would request this particular song, and there things in there that seem to implicate the breeding being different. He talks a little bit about in the song about it being Friday and the kind of waiting to Sunday on their knees, and it's sensitive, right? You do this in good taste. Then I show them the beginning of the clip, because I always show them a YouTube clip that was taken from a live performance, and I skip the beginning. Then I go to the beginning where Bono introduces the clip, the lead singer, and he explains to them that it's a meaningful clip to them because it reminds them, of course, of the person that has passed away. And then he says that he can't believe how this song, that was originally a hangover song, has become what they now call a gospel song. And so typically my students go, wait, did he just say hangover song? And that actually is the history of the song. When U2 was just a young rock band, they wrote this song in a hotel room after a night of hard partying, and they were struggling with hangovers, and they worried that their wives and their girlfriends would take them back. Now they were Christians, but they were kind of struggling. This is in the young years where fame comes sudden and there's pressures on them, and there was a lot of excess, and they didn't realize they worried that their wives, their girlfriends would take them back. And then Sunday is a reference to faith, and so they talked about crawling back on their knees. But there were also aspects in that song that Joey Ramone identified with that gave him courage in his final hours. And so then I asked the question in class, does it make sense that you in essence reappropriate, give a different function to the same lyrics that gives somebody else a sense of comfort in your final hours, even though the song originally was just written about, can we go back and face our women after we have partied too much? And that often gives us an interesting conversation. And then I typically ask something about art in general. Can you give a different meaning to art that has been purposed differently by the artist, and then somebody else, can we reinterpret that? And it always gives an interesting opinion. Most people say, yeah, you can. And then I ask the question, what about literature, and poetry? Can you reinterpret? Can you get something else out of it than what the author originally intended? And then we come in a roundabout way to the New Testament, and we deal with this very question here. How shall we read and understand letters in the New Testament, right? And so what do you think? Do you think that it's possible that the authors of the New Testament letters were writing to specific situations, right, in specific places, in a specific time, dealing with issues there, but that we read it and that we give it a different meaning for where we are? And typically, I don't know where you are, right? But typically my students say, yeah, like in general, you can read the Bible and it may originally have been written by an author to mean one thing, but you read it and you get something else out of it, and it gives you comfort. And so typically my students go, yeah, that's very possible. And then I ask, but are there dangers? Are there dangers when you ascribe a different meaning to, in particular, a letter than was originally intended by the author or the community who wrote it? And when you get this, we call it reader's response. When you respond as a reader to the text, is that wrong? Is that okay? Do we do this automatically? Do you always have a sense of bias? Can God work with that? And is there a danger with it? And so some people say there's no danger, and others catch on and say, wait. So when we think about the history of what we call interpretation, history of how we have read letters, we haven't done always so well in the history of Christianity or the church, right? So it's one thing to read good things into it that are in line with Jesus's values, his value of peace. My peace I leave with you. Love one another. A new commandment I give unto you. If it's all these values of Jesus, but we've done a poor job sometimes by reading the letters and reading our preconceived notions into it. And we have pretty much sometimes done injustice in society. And we have deemed people of different ethnicities, of different socioeconomic groups, of different genders, of different age groups, less than other people, based simply on how we want to read the text. So we can also impose our ideas on text and get something out of it that is not for the good, that does not promote what Jesus stood for. And how do you guard against that? And so there has to be some principles, and we will talk about that later. There has to be some principles about how do you retain some of that original intent? How do you allow some freedom and creativity for God to work in people's lives with these texts? And how do we guard against the evils of racism and discrimination and doing everything that God does not stand for? So it's not that easy, actually, to read Bible text. Well, something else that we look at is there's different kinds of letters. There's some that actually do not really say who wrote it. We call those anonymous letters. The letter to the Hebrews is one of them, doesn't identify who wrote it. We have pseudonymous letters, that those are letters that are written under a different author's name. So it invokes a person. You know, some people think that Second Peter is like that. It uses the name of Peter, but maybe was not written by Peter. Some letters that we ascribe to Paul, we call them Pauline letters, may not have been written to Paul. We'll come back on that. And then we have letters that are from known authors that most scholars agree on truly were written by known authors. Almost all scholars agree that the letter to the Romans truly was written by Paul. And almost all scholars agree that First John truly was written by John. So we now have a different genre, right? So we have seen the gospel genre, we've seen the narrative genre, the book of Acts, and now we are at what we call the letter genre. We have one more genre to go, that's the apocalyptic genre. So remember, the first part is greetings, and so we see them sometimes at the beginning, sometimes at the end of letters. Romans has a glaring example at the very end, where you see that somebody's actually writing the letter. It's being dictated, perhaps. I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. In Galatians, Paul says, look, I'm using really large letters when I write, so somebody else typically writes that. We see multiple people writing. So Paul and Silvanus and Timothy are writing the opening to First Thessalonians. Here you see an example in First Peter, of Peter giving himself a title, an identity as he writes. And then in First Peter, it's Paul an apostle, but in Second Peter, it's Simeon Peters. And that's where we think it's a pseudonym, giving his Jews another name. And I've always liked this cartoon where we're going to talk a little bit here about Paul, the letter writer, because we just simply have a lot of letters written by Paul, so it gives us kind of a window into letter writing in the New Testament. But I like this particular cartoon. We say, you know, he may have some lesser known epistles. Yo, what's up, Corinth? So letters associated with Paul, there's 13 that kind of traditionally are associated with Paul as a writer. Now notice you see U's and you see D's. U stands for undisputed, and undisputed means there's no dispute. Like people agree that Paul wrote those. And then the D's correspondingly, right, stands for disputed, which means sometimes there is dispute. There's differences of opinion whether or not Paul actually wrote those. Now, Second Thessalonians, not a whole lot of disputes. A couple of people in Germany, to think maybe Paul didn't write it. But typically you find some dispute whether or not Paul wrote Ephesians and Colossians. And you see a lot more dispute whether or not Paul wrote what we call the pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that in a minute. First of all, ancient writings. It's interesting when we see book covers and we see paintings, we tend to portray it as, one person like Paul sitting somewhere kind of anachronistically, which means out of chronological order or historical order, sitting behind the desk with a chicken feather writing page after page. Or even when he is in prison, you see just Paul with like one person who is dictating and who is writing there. That just doesn't seem to comply with our idea of how the social work functions, right? Look at the opening in Galatians, right? It says, Paul, an apostle, sent neither by human commission nor from human authorities, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the members of God's family who are with me. And then he addresses it to the churches in Galatia. And I think there's a reason why he mentions all the members of God's family who are with him. One is rhetorically, right, to give it some punch, some authority. But it's also because we're thinking more about community writing. Now, we are not used to community writing. Even when I assign a group paper in classes, people are like, oh, please, no group paper. I'd much rather write it alone, because we are focused on individualism, right? But remember, this is a group-focused kind of society. People do things in groups. So imagine the Apostle Paul, for example, right? Writing. He sits somewhere, and now I want you to just imagine that these are groups. He sits somewhere, there's people around him, especially when he's traveling and not in prison. And he says, I'm about to write a letter to Corinth. Goodness, we need to pray. There's some stuff going on there, and I need some wisdom. And they go like, yeah, let's pray together. And he said, no, I've been thinking, I want to write this. I want to mention that. How do y'all feel about this? And so they give their opinion. He goes, okay, taking in some wisdom. He's talking about it, and they pray about it. Then one of the women said, hey, we're done baking the bread. It's time to eat. So they stop, they eat something. While they eat, they talk about some other aspects, and they write some. It's more of a community affair, community writing. Now, one person still represents the writing, that's Paul, but it's a community effort. We're just not used to it, right? So there are examples, at least, of co-writing. We call them, Paul writes, or like in the last instance, like Peter writes it. But even in the greetings, other people are mentioned. So letters associated with Paul, or what I would call the Pauline community, people who travel with him, those co-authors. So now, for one, we do not necessarily always agree as scholars on which one was written first. Some people think that he wrote Galatians first. Other people would say that he wrote one of the Thessalonian letters first. It's not like extremely significant which one it was, though. It does help us with, composing a chronology there. We also cannot really agree on whether or not Ephesians and Colossians was primarily written with Paul in leadership over the Pauline community, right? There's a group that says he did not because the style is different. And then there's a group that says, well, the style is different because Paul actually employs there a different style of writing. We call it rhetoric. And it's more in line with ancient rhetoric because those churches are in Asia Minor, current day Turkey, and that's why they look different. And then the letters that are often deemed as not originating with Paul himself, like Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy, they seem to have some later features of church community. Like it doesn't seem as young or as during the time that Paul still would have lived. Most people believe that Paul probably died in the aftermath of the fire in Rome, that he was punished there, was beheaded like in 64, 65. But he had gathered so many people around him that the community was so used to co-write letters with him that they could continue to write in his name, and did so while honoring him. Now, we are not used to this idea of honoring a person and then using the person's name on Peter or on Paul in order to honor. We would think that's plagiarism. But in antiquity, people sometimes did that. They could do it to give legitimacy to a writing, right? Like the Apocalypse of Peter or First Enoch or something, to gather some momentum, right? But they could also do it to honor their teacher. And sometimes we wonder if that's what's going on here, okay? And that completes some thoughts here about letter writing in the New Testament.